Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We got him.
That was the governor of Utah announcing the suspect for the assassination of Charlie Kirk is now in custody. He's been identified. We have some sense of what may have motivated him to commit his crime, or the crime he's alleged to have committed. I'll be discussing all of that and more with Aaron Bastani. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. We've got Ariana as well. She won't be here for the whole hour, but I think she wants to say hello to Uncle Mike.
Oh, very gorgeous. Hello, Ariana. Don't tug on that mic too much. These are very expensive pieces of equipment. I'm sure she knows that. We'll also be discussing why Noam Chomsky was right about political violence. And we have a separate story about the UK councils having to bribe private landlords to house homeless people.
I think with a high degree of certainty, we have him in custody, right? In custody. Everyone did a great job. We worked with the local police, the governor. Everybody did a great job. You know, getting somebody that you start off with absolutely nothing. And we started off with a clip that made him look like an ant that was almost useless. We just saw there was somebody up there. And so much work has been done over the last 2.5 days. You know, it's amazing, actually, when you start off with that and then all of a sudden you get lucky or talent or whatever it is. But yeah, I think we're in great shape.
Mr. President.
And he's in custody.
It seems like it probably was more luck than talent, given the person handed themselves in, or at least their family did. Of course, that was Donald Trump this morning revealing the FBI's manhunt had been successful and that the suspect for the assassination of Charlie Kirk was in custody. In a press conference later in the day, hosted by the FBI and Utah's governor, it was announced that the suspect was 22-year-old Tyler Robinson. Mugshots of Robinson were released by the FBI, who is alleged to have admitted the crime to his father, who then told a family friend, who then arranged for him to be handed in to the police. So who is Tyler Robinson, and what might have motivated him to kill Charlie Kirk, if indeed he did? Well, in terms of who he is, Robinson is a student at Utah State University on a scholarship. His father is a law enforcement veteran and his mother a care worker. They introduced him to guns at a young age, which we'll speak about a bit later. That might explain his shooting skills. In terms of a motive, though, this was Utah's governor speaking earlier today.
Investigators interviewed a family member of Robinson who stated that Robinson had become more political in recent years. The family member referenced a recent incident in which Robinson came to dinner prior to September 10th, and in the conversation with another family member, Robinson mentioned Charlie Kirk was coming to UVU. They talked about why they didn't like him and the viewpoints that he had. The family member also stated Kirk was full of hate and spreading hate.
There were other clues on the bullet casing found by police.
Investigators noted inscriptions that had been engraved on casings found with the rifle. Inscriptions on a fired casing read, "Notices, bulges, capital OWO, what's this, question mark." Inscriptions on the 3 unfired casings read, "Hey fascist, exclamation point, catch, exclamation point." Up arrow symbol, right arrow, and symbol, and 3 down arrow symbols. A second unfired casing read, "Oh Bella Chow, Bella Chow, Bella Chow, Chow Chow." And a third unfired casing read, "If you read this, you are gay, LMAO."
So, Hey Fascist, Catch, that's pretty self-explanatory. Bella Ciao, that's a song adopted by World War II era partisans of the Italian resistance who fought Nazi Germany. So again, the motives are clear there. The other 3 are somewhat odder. So, notices, bulges, ow wow, what's this, is apparently a phrase used to parody furries and online role-play subcultures, which is typically used online as a method of trolling. And then the up arrow, right arrow, and 3 down arrow symbols, that is apparently a reference to a sequence of controller moves that unleashes bombs on the popular video game Helldivers 2. And then finally, if you read this, you are gay lamau. That just seems like a reference to online trolling culture. I've sort of seen some people online suggest that's homophobic. I think it's more just a sort of mindless troll that people do online. I don't think we can read much more into it than that. Aaron, this guy appears to be a very online anti-fascist. Is there anything more we can say about him?
Well, I don't even know if he's necessarily anti-fascist. It's early days. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of speculating about his views. I mean, we have some confirmed evidence, i.e., his age, his family background, his facility with guns, and yeah, he's carved some things into a bullet. We don't know necessarily his sort of psychological well-being, his mental state. It would suggest he has some acquaintance with online political cultures. I think it's probable that he's not on the far radical right. There was sort of a view that maybe he could be a groyper, that it's people on the right of Charlie Kirk, criticizing Charlie Kirk. Doesn't appear to be that. But equally, I wouldn't want to speculate about his political leanings necessarily. I do find it quite extraordinary given his personal background. We know, for instance, his father was, like you say, served for a very long time as a sheriff. I think his parents may be registered Republicans, although he wasn't registered politically. This is not the archetypal person you'd associate with the radical left. And so if he has been radicalized, it's in ways that aren't necessarily that coherent or legible immediately. And I think that's the kind of stuff that will come to the fore in the next couple of days.
Are you underplaying what we can interpret from these engravings a little bit? Because, I mean, Charlie Kirk is known as a right-wing commentator who will often be called a fascist. And the bullet was inscribed with "Hey Fascist, Catch" and "Bella Ciao." I mean, obviously, we will be finding out much more about Tyler Robinson in the coming days. We don't know too much about his identity. But the idea that Charlie Kirk was targeted because of his politics from the left, because this person believed he was a fascist, that seems relatively clear, doesn't it?
I think it's moderately clear, but I'd also add that we don't know this person's mental state. I mean, they could have been, they could have been in a situation where they're being treated for something. I'm not trying to minimize their responsibility for murdering somebody else. I'm just saying that I think the whole thing looks so politically incoherent. I think it's worth waiting for that. Like I say, I think this is pretty conclusive evidence that he's not, quote unquote, a groyper. A Nick Fuentes viewer who's criticizing Charlie Kirk from the right, which was plausible. But at the same time, I just think jumping to conclusions aren't helpful. We can speculate about what we know, and you're right to say, well, we know this stuff. But again, it's just, there's not many socialists I know, Michael, and maybe I'm showing my age, who would claim to be anti-fascist and then say, you are gay, LMAO. It's just not something that, LMAO, as you said, it's just not something you would normally associate with sort of radical leftists. So I think there's something more going on, and there's something quite significant about very recent changes in online culture, actually post-COVID online culture, and I think that is not even a left-right thing, and that's not to minimize political leanings. I think you're probably right, but I think something deeper is going on as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it can just be put down to ideology. I think the fact that he's so sort of engrossed in internet subcultures, I think, speaks to something as well. One party relay says, "Where's the trans ideology? Why did they say that?" Now, that's a reference to a story last week, which was published yesterday, and published in the Wall Street Journal, which had referred to an internal memo within the police or some kind of law enforcement agency. It was somewhat unclear, which suggested that the bullets had been engraved with anti-fascist and trans ideology. I'm using the words they used, and clearly that's not that. Well, the anti-fascist ideology does seem to be there. The trans ideology, if there is such a thing, isn't there. From what I read, it seems like there might have been a misunderstanding by whoever was sort of filling in this memo, because they thought the arrows, which were actually a reference to someone bombing something on a game, they thought that had something to do with transgender people or trans rights. Obviously a mistake, and pretty irresponsible of the Wall Street Journal to put that out, because it led to lots of people on social media saying, can we now admit that being trans is a mental illness and it's all dangerous? So I think that article led to quite a lot of hate, and it ended up being very much misleading. I mentioned earlier that Tyler Robinson seems to have been introduced to guns at a young age. Twitter users this afternoon found Tyler's mother's Facebook, which includes a post about her kids on a camping, hiking and shooting holiday. The post is from 2014. So Tyler, who you can see, I'm pretty sure that's him, pictured there with a gun. He would have been 10 or 11. And this is another set of photos from what looks like the military base of Tyler's uncle. So from the caption that Amber Robinson has put there, that's what I interpret from that. Again, all the family are holding guns. And Tyler can be seen here, presumably aged 14, sort of dating his age in the years, and posing with what appears to be a mounted machine gun. Aaron, there had been lots of speculation online that, it was a very effective shot. It was one shot from a distance, which killed Charlie Kirk seemingly sort of instantly, straight in the neck. So people were thinking this must be some kind of trained assassin or sniper shooter. I suppose growing up with guns might also explain how this guy seemed so competent at killing someone from a distance.
Yeah, and also making his escape, having that cold-bloodedness to do it. I mean, from what I've seen, I've fired a rifle a few times in my life, but it's not something that's big in British culture unless you own a farm or work on a farm, or an agricultural worker. But from what people have said, a shot from 200, 250 yards isn't a particularly difficult shot. But to do it under those conditions, you've got one chance. You would have thought this. Well, many people were speculating that this would be a veteran, at the very least, somebody very, very, very acquainted with using firearms, and that's what's happened. Again, coming at this from a British perspective, and some people will be watching and listening to this from the US. I simply do not understand why you allow so many people to have firearms. I simply do not understand it. Right. I know this isn't an automatic weapon. This is a sniper rifle, and that's used for hunting and so on. I think there's a broader question about gun ownership in the United States, which isn't going to go away. Maybe now, if there is a spate of shootings which are less easily coded as being by people on the right, maybe that will be a more balanced political conversation. But if you look at the use of guns historically in the United States over the 20th and 21st century in terms of political violence, overwhelmingly used by people on the right. You look at the big murders of the 1960s in American public life: Robert Kennedy, of course, JFK, Martin Luther King. Fred Hampton was killed by the CIA, FBI, but still, gun violence has generally gone one way. I should be fair. Fred Hampton was killed by state forces. You suspect that if you do start to see a range of political ideologies using violence in this way, that actually the flavor of that conversation will change. I suspect it will. I think exposing children to firearms that one associates with militaries or paramilitaries, frankly, is psychotic. That's just me. People are welcome to think I'm a weird person for saying that. I think that's pretty much a mainstream view in this country, certainly. It's not in the US. I think, Michael, if you look at what's changed in the last 35 years, we all have access now to much more information than before. We all have access to publishing information than before. The cost of entry to publishing information and reaching a wide audience, whether it's video, audio, text, obviously incredibly low with social media and personal computers and mobile phones. You see a decline in trust in public authorities. I think you throw that all together and you have a populace which is heavily armed. I just don't think it ends very well. I mean, if you look at it sort of objectively, I don't see how you avoid sort of mass civil unrest / conflict. And clearly one of the ingredients there is access to firearms, which I frankly don't think is going to change anytime soon in the US. And as many problems as we have here in the UK, the same sort of structural issues around the privatization of truth. The access to guns is something I'm very grateful for, or the lack of it, I should say.
I mean, even just as sort of like, I would be scared of doing events in America. I mean, not enough people know who I am in America, but sort of, if Novara Live were doing events in the UK and I knew that everyone had it within their right to be carrying a gun, I don't know, I just wouldn't want to do it, I think. While figures on the right, including Fox News hosts and the president, have used the tragedy of Charlie Kirk's assassination as a moment to incite revenge against the left, everyone of any significance on the left has continued to speak out against political violence in all its forms. Bernie Sanders released this video on Thursday.
A free and democratic society, which is what America is supposed to be about, depends upon the basic premise that people can speak out, organize, and take part in public life without fear, without worrying that they might be killed, injured, or humiliated for expressing their political views. In fact, that is the essence of what freedom is about and what democracy is about. You have a point of view, that's great. I have a point of view that is different than yours. That's great. Let's argue it out. We make our case to the American people at the local, state, and federal levels, and we hold free elections in which the people decide what they want. That's called freedom and democracy. And I want as many people as possible to participate in that process without fear. Freedom and democracy is not about political violence.
Now, that's basically been the line of every prominent left-wing politician and commentator in the United States. There have been people celebrating Kirk's death, but that's pretty much been confined to a few fairly minor accounts on Twitter and Blue Sky. Lots of them have loads and loads of likes, so there clearly is a lot of people who are sort of comfortable with political violence, but none of them of sort of people who are, let's say, sort of part of the Democratic Party or part of sort of major left-wing organizations or media organizations. It's a sort of marginal thing. I suppose I want to talk, potentially to those people who are celebrating it online. And I want to do that via Noam Chomsky, who I think probably has the best response. The linguist and political theorist has previously said that over the years he's received a flood of letters from mostly young readers confused by his rejection of violence in responding to a resurgent far right. And this is his standard response. So he shared this with a writer, John Howell, who he gave permission to publish it. So this is what Noam Chomsky says in emails to people who ask him about political violence. He says it's wrong in principle and tactically self-destructive. When we move to the arena of violence, the most brutal guys win. That's the worst outcome. And incidentally, it's not us. The right response is to use the opportunity for education and exposure, not to give a gift to the hard right while attacking fundamental principles of freedom of speech. We've been through all this before, for example, with Weathermen. The Vietnamese pleaded with them to stop actions like these, understanding very well that each such act simply increased support for the war. In this case, the motive is far less significant, but the consequences are very likely to be the same, and we can see that they already are. That's quite apart from the question of principle. There could be a constructive response that would not simply be a welcome gift to the far right and those elements in the state yearning for a pretext for repression, to use the opportunity for education and organizing. Now, I mean, if you saw Trump's response to this murder, which was played yesterday, you can see how there were elements of the far right who do want to use this as an opportunity for repression. He basically said this is all of the left's fault and we need to clamp down on them. Incredibly irresponsible from him. Aaron, I think Noam Chomsky sort of hits it on the head there. I'd like to know your perspective.
No, I couldn't agree more. And it's not just Noam Chomsky that's saying this. And, he says we've been here before. He's talking about the Weatherman Underground in the 1960s. You can go back further. There's been a critique of adventurism from the organized left for many decades, actually, all the way through to the late 19th century. And the sort of generic Marxist argument against adventurism is that the only way to transform society is through the mass action and consciousness raising of the masses. And the idea that that can come from the outside through violent agitation, that was their critique of anarchism, right, at the end of the 19th century. Not anarcho-syndicalism, anarchist assassinations, which at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century were happening all the time. King Umberto in Italy being one example, but many, many others too. It was an era of assassinations by anarchists. Joseph Conrad wrote a very good novel about it, actually, based on reality. So there is a very long-standing left-wing critique of this kind of action. And, immediately after this happened, you had people saying, oh, this is Mossad, right? Or this is a state agency. This is the deep state because they're trying to achieve X outcome. I don't think that. We don't, from what we know so far, that isn't the case. Even before the arrest of this 22-year-old man, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said it was somebody radicalized by a domestic political cause. I wouldn't know what it is. But the fact that people can say, oh, it's Mossad, or it's the FBI, or it's a foreign intelligence agency, that tells you how stupid this is, right? Now, I don't think it was Mossad, like I'm saying, but it's a coherent thing. Why would you do that? To drive polarization in American civil society, to help foster an environment which would be entirely critical and increasingly angry and contemptuous of people on the left, people demanding justice for the people of Palestine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're saying that because the cause and effect makes sense, which really underscores how politically stupid this is. I mean, we see this time after time, Michael. When I saw that, you see the first video, and we've spoken about this now for a few days, you see the initial video, you think, okay, he's hurt. But it could be an air rifle, could be anything. Then you see the second video and you think, my goodness, one of the most awful things you can imagine seeing. And obviously, my first thoughts are, he's passed away. He's been murdered. Then I think about his 2 kids and his wife. I think about the 2 kids because they're not going to grow up with a father. But then I think about the political violence that's going to follow in retaliation to this, to people who simply don't deserve it. And if you can't see that, then you're an idiot. And I think the people celebrating his death, you're allowed to be ambivalent. You're allowed to be ambivalent about absolutely anything in life, okay? You might have too much going on in your own sort of personal space to care about stuff happening elsewhere, or something that doesn't concern you. That's a lot of people a lot of the time, I get it. But to celebrate somebody else's death, I find odd. To do it publicly in America at a moment of tremendous political polarization is really, really unwise. And I'm sure many people who've done it hadn't thought about it. They'll regret it. But there are real political consequences as a result. And it's just it's not good. And you've quoted Chomsky, and that's very apposite. We have been here before multiple times. The 60s, the 70s, the late 19th century, the early 20th century. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Oh, well, you're a revolutionary socialist. That is not what Lenin and Trotsky were advocating. That's not what Rosa Luxemburg was advocating. Doesn't mean they were, Gene Sharp, oh, please don't use violence. They didn't say that. There's multiple things here. They didn't say that. In a liberal democracy, when you do have freedom of speech, when you do have freedom of assembly, when you do have freedom of the press, all the caveats that, yes, the press is owned by billionaires, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No serious left-wing thinker of the last century and a bit has advocated the assassination or the use of murder as a political tool. Nobody.
As I said, the few people celebrating Charlie Kirk's death are mainly sort of small accounts on Twitter or Blue Sky, some of them with lots of likes, but as I say, not significant people. Most leftists and liberals are calling for calm. Not Donald Trump, though. He spoke to Fox and Friends on Friday.
Radicals on the right as well. We have radicals on the left. People are watching all of these videos and cheering. Some people are cheering that Charlie was killed. How do we fix this country? How do we come back together?
I'll tell you something that's going to get me in trouble, but I couldn't care less. The radicals on the right oftentimes are radical because they don't want to see crime. They don't want to see crime.
Worried about the border.
They're saying, we don't want these people coming in. We don't want you burning our shopping centers. We don't want you shooting our people in the middle of the street. The radicals on the left are the problem. And they're vicious and they're horrible and they're politically savvy. Although they want men and women sports, they want transgender for everyone. They want open borders.
It's so dangerous, right? He's saying, actually, the radicals on the right, I don't care about them because I agree with what they're doing. I agree with their cause. So if they, shoot someone, that's, who get, because obviously there are lots of right-wing murders in the United States, right? Just last month or 2 months ago, there was a Democratic state representative who was shot by someone who was a Trump supporter, who was a sort of religious right-winger, really anti-abortion, right? And he killed someone. But Donald Trump doesn't care about that. He says, these people are actually kind of good people. And that's so dangerous having a president saying that. Obviously, calling Trump dangerous, is water wet. But I don't think we should start to ignore it just because it's not surprising. Just to remind you who is the major problem when it comes to extreme political violence in the United States. So this is from the ADL. I disagree with them on lots of stuff, but I don't see why they'd be wrong here. Right-wing extremists are responsible for the great majority of extremist-related murders over the last decade. So they say 76% of extremist-related murders committed by right-wing extremists. Left-wing extremists have committed 4%, Islamist extremists 18%, and other miscellaneous extremism 1%. Aaron, how dangerous do you think things are in the United States at the moment? As you said sort of earlier, lots of people have guns, and you've got a president who does seem to want to use this shooting a bit like a Reichstag fire, right? Sort of saying, this is the moment where we're not, we're not playing games anymore. Now is the time to clamp down on anyone who's ever disagreed with us.
Yeah, I don't think this is a von der Lube moment. You're talking about the Dutch communist who basically creates the pretext for shutting down anything resembling democracy in Germany in the 1930s. I don't think that's quite there. I think we're pretty close, right? I think if this person was, a member of a trade union with a very overt, documented record of left-wing activism and so on, I think we could have seen that. I don't think we're quite there yet. I could be wrong. Let's see what happens in the next 72 hours, the next week. But I think that's clearly the direction of travel. And I think people really need to grasp this, Michael. If you think it's legitimate to kill people for words, and Charlie Kirk said awful things. He said lots of awful things. He was an apologist for lots of awful things. But if you think it's legitimate to kill somebody for words, you are opening up an extraordinary can of worms. Think about it, okay? If you're saying I support political assassinations, apartheid South Africa, right? We can all think of conditions where you support political assassinations. Would you kill a senior member of the Third Reich in the 1930s? Of course I'd hope I would. But in a liberal democracy, the idea that you would kill people, and some people have even said, well, the people at Nuremberg, the Nazi apologists at Nuremberg, the propagandists were killed. That was after literally the most bloody war of the 20th century. I just think it's a very unhealthy analogy. And if you're raising the stakes there, good luck, by the way, the people on quote unquote your side, because they're all goners. We're gone, Michael, right? If you think that's how it works, if one person, if we now privatize this thing, if one person takes hideous offense at what one other person has said, they are now entitled to shoot them. There's nobody left. Okay? There's nobody left. Only the most boring people with no opinions are left. There's nobody left. So I think it's an insane justification, frankly. Doesn't mean you have to start saying, I love the guy, he's a wonderful man. It's a red line. You can't shoot people for saying things, right? And you might say, well, it's incitement, so on. And I think the fact that so many people now have blurred these lines does really put the US in a very dangerous place, Michael. I saw one tweet saying, let's try far-right violence by some far-right idiot on X. Lots of people, Michael, when they think about 1963 and Martin Luther King, they think about the I Have a Dream speech, right? That is the clip. 10 seconds, oh yeah, that was the civil rights movement. Everybody suddenly agreed that blacks and whites could get along just because this guy gave a great speech. That's not how it happened, okay? Because actually a few weeks after he gave that speech, a white supremacist, I think it was in Alabama, firebombed, it wasn't firebombed, sorry, it was TNT, a group of white supremacists, I need to get this right. TNT, they blew up a building and they killed 4 little black girls, okay? That's a few weeks after the MLK speech. So when people say, well, we should try far-right violence, actually, why not? America is built. If you want to be like that, it's built on far-right violence. It's built on genocide of the indigenous populations. It's built on a slave class. Now, nobody who's alive today is responsible for any of that, and I'm not suggesting they are, but the aftershocks of that reverberated for a very long time. To some extent, of course, they still do, but most certainly until the Civil Rights Act, until the mid-1960s in the United States, in I think 13, 14, 15 states, Black Americans and white Americans could not marry. You had anti-miscegenation laws. During the lifetime of my dad, who's still alive, this is in the mid-1960s. So there's been a tremendous amount of far-right violence and, actual terror in the example I gave of 1963 TNT, where 4 little girls were blown up. You could talk about Timothy McVeigh and so on. And again, to return to the point I made earlier on, the 3 most iconic political assassinations of 20th century America, JFK, RFK, as in the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, they're not killed by radical leftists. If you think about who kills Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, he's killed by a hard right Zionist. He's killed by somebody who, is coming from the other direction. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no such thing as left-wing political violence. Of course there is. Chomsky, who you saw earlier on, mentions the Weatherman Underground. Of course there is. But for much of the last, like I say, century, certainly since the Second World War, that's not been the case in the English-speaking countries. Somewhere like Italy, different story. Somewhere like Germany, different story. But particularly if you're talking about the United States, that's where we are. And I think, I'll finish with this. Once you start legitimizing political violence for words, you don't know where it ends. You have no idea. You have no idea. And maybe I'm saying this as somebody who, I've got quite a Hobbesian view of the world, Michael, because my dad is Iranian. He's in this country. He was studying in this country when the Iranian Revolution happens. So he didn't leave Iran. He was here, but he couldn't go back because you get the Iranian Revolution, and then of course you get the Iran-Iraq War of 80 to 88. The Iran-Iraq War kills about 1 million people, about 500,000 people both sides. Saddam uses chemical weapons against civilian populations left, right, and center. Now, the trigger for all of that is really the Iranian Revolution. Saddam doesn't invade Iran unless he spots an opportunity. And that's not to defend the Shah or oppose the Shah. I don't like the Shah. I wish Mossadegh hadn't been removed by the CIA and MI6 in the 1950s. But once you open that can of worms, things can get really bad really quickly. And if you're a committed revolutionary, that's fine, right? If you're somebody who's like, yeah, I'm going to take up arms, that's my cup of tea, fine. But most of the people celebrating this stuff, that ain't their cup of tea. They wouldn't last 10 minutes under those conditions. And it's something we talked about very, very frequently with regards to the Syrian civil war. We need to arm the moderate rebels. There's no such thing as moderates in a civil war. The people that succeed are the most frenzied, fanatical, and violent. Okay? Those are not the optimal conditions for good politics. When people talk about the distortion of the Russian Revolution after 1917, and I think the USSR accomplished many positive things, people say, well, once you have the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War of the 20s, you're immediately creating path dependency where the politics of that state, that government, were inclined to authoritarianism, a military hierarchy, secret police, ultra-violence that's kind of priced in. Just to be able to cling on to power when you've got all these foreign imperial powers trying to undermine the Bolshevik Revolution, which I agree with, by the way, by virtue of that, and to win, the Red Army had to become an incredibly violent organization, and politics became a very violent undertaking. And like I say, if you're used to, your Chinese consumer durables and your soft drinks and your processed meats and watching YouTube videos, I like lots of those things, Michael. Be careful what you wish for, because killing people for words ends in very, 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 very dreadful places, very dreadful, horrific places, the worst places.
This is a pretty crazy story from The Guardian. So English councils are paying private landlords millions in incentives to house homeless families. Now, of course, councils paying landlords to house homeless people is nothing new. They have a legal duty to house homeless families. And because they were forced to sell off huge chunks of their housing stock, they have nowhere to put them other than the private rental sector. What's new about this story, though, is that these millions of pounds aren't going on rent, but rather one-off payments to landlords simply to allow poor people to rent their homes. So The Guardian report this. Data gathered by the campaign group Generation Rent via Freedom of Information request showed that 37 councils spent more than £31 million on one-off cash payments to private landlords on 10,792 occasions in 2024 to 2025. There's a quote from Ben Twomey from Generation Rent. He says, the soaring cost of renting and the government's decision to freeze the local housing allowance has put councils across the country in a near impossible position. In a desperate bid to avoid placing people in temporary accommodation, they're forced to pay individual landlords sometimes tens of thousands of pounds just for them to agree to rent out their home. It's a senseless waste of money. Of course, councils aren't doing this just for the hell of it. They don't really have much choice. So this is how the councils who are giving these lump sums to landlords justified it. So Grace Williams, the executive member for housing and regeneration at London Councils, said the capital was grappling with the most extreme homelessness emergency in the country, and boroughs were facing huge difficulties meeting their legal duty to find accommodation for homeless residents. Rather than using expensive hotels and B&Bs, working with local landlords in the private rented sector can secure better outcomes for homeless families and improved value for money, she said. Now, this executive member for housing and regeneration at London councils, she's probably right. So councils spent a total of £2.3 billion on temporary accommodation in the year 2023 to 2024. And that completely, of course, dwarfs the £31 million that's being paid in one-off incentives to private landlords. So one-off incentives to get people in regular private housing instead of temporary accommodation. Both sums, of course, are pretty huge and a sign of the fact that councils have sold off all of the housing that they could have put these people in. Aaron, it's a sort of familiar story, but I do think this sort of sums up to quite a large degree the extent to which councils are they have to go and beg the private sector to house people. And again, remember, it's the council's legal duty to house these people. So the council doesn't have a choice. So the central state has left councils with the legal obligation to house people, but also since Thatcher has obliged them to sell off their own housing. So the reason you've got all of these broke councils is because you've said, well, you have to house these people, but we're not going to give you the resources to build your own houses. You're going to have to beg private landlords to put them up. And it seems just a very irrational way of organising a state to me.
Yeah, so there's lots of expectations, like you say, duties, not just with regards to housing, but also things like elderly care, social care that is placed on local authorities. So they have these responsibilities, but they don't have the means by which to resolve them. So someone like Gothenburg in Sweden, Michael, if they have a particular issue, whether it's transport infrastructure, one example, maybe they want to undertake a greening initiative somewhere, which is going to cost lots of money, they can raise taxes. And we are very unique, Michael, as an advanced economy with a very developed civil society. We don't actually give major cities the ability, or local authorities, we don't give them the ability to raise their own revenues to a significant extent. This, of course, is part of the reason why local authorities are bankrupting themselves. Okay, so I think we've long argued for things like social care that shouldn't actually be held at the local level, whatever you think. I think housing probably should. So this is a question of being able to generate your own revenues. There's two ways to do that, of course. Can they borrow on wider markets, financial markets? I think they should be able to. That, of course, can come with downsides because a local authority might screw up and bankrupt themselves. People make bad financial bets all the time. Should they also be able to play around with their own tax base? I think so. We are so far away from that, though, Michael. Even somewhere like the Scottish Parliament have very minimal tax raising powers. They have some, and they're quite recent, but they're not very significant. I would like to see local authorities having far more tax raising powers. Right now, of course, you have council tax, but even then, there's a cap of 5%. If it's going to be more than that, you have to make up all kinds of, there's tons of caveats. But I would like to see a lot more than that. I think I'd like to see a local sales tax too. I think probably you have a national VAT rate of maybe 15% or maybe lower. And then you have a local consumption tax as well that would top it up, or maybe you don't want to top it up, right? That would be one way of doing it. Maybe that wouldn't be particularly progressive, other ways too. But like I say, someone like Bristol has appalling transport infrastructure. It's much bigger than someone like Gothenburg. If Gothenburg has those problems, they'll raise money somehow. Bristol, though, much bigger place, can't do that. Leeds can't do that. You're dependent on the largesse of the central state. With housing, it's of course even worse because the state has these expectations of you, but you're getting very, very, very little in terms of resources being made available. But look, Michael, central government under neoliberalism wants local authorities to fail. They don't want effective local government. Why? Because if you have effective local government, which is not based upon the market principle, it fundamentally undermines the ideological substrate, claims, principles of neoliberalism. If you have an effective local authority which can administer public transport, housing, and other things too, really well, without recourse entirely to private ownership, then all of a sudden, for the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute of Economic Affairs and all the other right-wing think tanks in central London, that's a big intellectual challenge. So a key part of their political project is for local government to be fundamentally dysfunctional. That's the point. That's the point. And the only parts of local government that will work under those conditions will be in wealthier areas. And all of a sudden, how do we define good local government? Who charges the lowest rate of council tax? And of course, in Westminster, for instance, one local authority in central London, you have historically low rates of council tax because it's quite an affluent place. A less affluent place is going to struggle more. So this dysfunction at the local level, Michael, is priced in. It's part of the project we've had in this country for 45 years. We see it with things like buses outside of London. We see it in social care, and we see it with stuff like this as well. It's kind of a varied picture. If you look at, for instance, HMOs, as I understand it, where I am, the local authority I am, politicians here can't do very much. They can't really do very much to stop HMOs, okay? You might have an area where, okay, if it goes above a certain level of density, they can stop it because you can't have more than X% of HMOs within a certain area. But if there are very few HMOs in an area, they can't really stop it. As I understand it, in local authorities, combined authorities rather, with a metro mayor, somewhat different. The mayor can intervene to a stronger extent, which is why I'm pro-mayors, frankly. One of the reasons why I'm pro-mayors. But when people say, I'm sick of the councillors, they won't stop this HMO, or they won't do this, or they won't do that, they are very, very constrained in what they can do. And that's by design.
Okay, so we talked about how this is a story about local councils being hamstrung, which I think it absolutely is. I think it is also a broader story which includes the state itself, so sort of a national government, in terms of how they have been left sort of desperate and with the begging bowl I suppose not the begging bowl, but sort of begging the private sector to do stuff because they can't do it themselves. And I've shown this chart before on this show, but I do think it does so much to explain the crises Western governments currently find themselves in. So it's from the World Inequality Report by Thomas Piketty. It shows how private wealth and public wealth has changed as a proportion of national income in major rich economies since 1970. So as you can see, private wealth has exploded since the 1970s as a proportion of GDP. So it used to be that total private wealth, so that's property, stocks and shares and the like, they used to be worth 2 to 4 times as much as annual GDP. That's now gone up to 5 to 7 times annual GDP. Remember, that won't just be rich people, that will also just be homeowners. Meanwhile, the value of public wealth has collapsed. This has been especially severe in the UK. So here, public wealth dropped from 60% of GDP in 1970 to minus 106% in 2020. And so what does that mean? Well, in the 1970s, the state used to have assets which it could draw upon to fulfill its vital functions and to give it leverage vis-a-vis the private sector and private actors. Now, when the state needs to do something, it has to beg the private sector to do it for them and to pay them handsomely in the process. Now, I think this is, Gary Stevenson actually sent me this chart, and I do think it explains so much because it's not, by the way, it's not about government debt. So government debt is about how much they owe the financial markets or the Bank of England. This is including assets and liabilities. So included in this would be, the rail network when they owned it, the coal power plants when they owned them, all the hospitals that they used to own, which are now owned by PFI companies. So it's not an argument as to say debt is bad. It's to say you want a bunch of assets that you can draw upon so that you're not constantly in hock to the private sector. I suppose your comments on that, Aaron, I just find that really instructive. I come back to it quite a lot.
Isn't it fascinating? Going back again to sort of neoliberalism. And of course, the fixation with home ownership in this country, and by the way, home ownership, owner occupancy is much higher in former communist countries and indeed continuing communist countries than it is in this country. But the fixation with home ownership goes back a very long way. That phrase of a property-owning democracy, I believe, goes back to the 1920s. But that fixation with owner occupancy, particularly with right to buy, just takes off in the 80s. So at the very same time, you have this idea that housing security is only possible if you own a property, right? You don't want to rent. You want to own. You want a home of your own. You want bricks and mortar. You want an asset, right? The exact same time that goes completely mainstream, literally the exact same time, you have an inverse rationality being deployed with regards to the state. Well, why should the state own anything? Why should it? The state should just sell everything, and then it can just procure services from people who now own the infrastructure it used to have, and then they can charge the state. It's a scandal, Michael. I mean, it's a scandal. We're not just talking about things like the water industry, which are a scam, actually. The water industry is the biggest scam in the history of this country. It's the biggest act of organized criminality, I think, in the history of this country. But if you look at this thing in the whole, it's just quite extraordinary. You know, Britain was, I think, maybe even the first country to use civilian nuclear energy, or the second. Britain was one of the first countries to have commercial jet airliners. It was one of the first countries to be able to have the ability to put a satellite into space. Extraordinary technology. You know, two countries on this planet managed to build at scale the kinds of bombers that Britain used in the Second World War to really, really excellent effect, the United States and Great Britain. So there's this extraordinary technological base at the end of the Second World War. We take that forward, 50s, 60s, 70s. You think Concorde, again, nuclear energy. You think about some of the civilian technologies that were developed under what became BT. Even with regards to high-speed rail, you know, intercity trains in this country in the 70s were pretty much cutting edge. They weren't bullet trains, but they were pretty cutting edge in terms of the technology being deployed. And then we've gone nowhere for 50 or 60 years. And you walk outside and the pavements look like shit. There's rubbish everywhere. Everything looks like crap. The public domain is terrible. You go into somebody's house and you're going to see £2,000 worth of consumer appliances. I can make a soft whip ice cream out of, you know, God knows what, frozen avocado and walnuts, right? So as a society, we've decided that doesn't matter, but this does. But going back to my original point, at the exact same time that we're told that security means owning assets, the inverse applies to the state. And as a result, we've impoverished the state. And that's a really, really big deal because, of course, the state is the last actor of resort in all manner of things, in a financial crisis, in a war, in a pandemic, to address certain social challenges like mass homelessness or ill health, a public health crisis. You need the state. We have impoverished the state. And we've impoverished it by inverting, like I say, the exact logic by which we say you should secure your future. Oh, think about inheritance tax. Don't tax inheritance because you want assets to give to your kids for their safety, their security, their long-term well-being. Why don't we think about that with the state? Well, hold on. When the state had, you know, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of resources, why couldn't future citizens inherit those? No, we decided basically to give them away. And that wasn't all 30, 40, 50 years ago. As recently as the 2010s, you have the privatization of Royal Mail, right? So for peanuts, by the way, for peanuts, this is a scandal. So I think, you know, when conservatives say that property ownership and asset ownership is the key to long-term stability and security, okay, you're right. Let's apply that now to the state. Let's start building stuff and let's start investing in things, right? You're told to get a mortgage to buy a house because in the long term, it's in your interest. Why can't you use debt in the same way to build infrastructure for the country? It's the exact same principle. No, we can't build HS2. It's going to cost too much. Okay, when you can't get out your mortgage, it's going to cost too much. Why don't you rent somewhere instead for the whole of your life? Well, no, that would be stupid. That would be insecure. That's short-term thinking. Okay, well, you described it yourself, short-term thinking.
I think that's really interesting, sort of talking about inheritance as well. I really like that. This idea, because they always say that when that sort of the argument for fiscal austerity is we can't possibly hand down this financial debt to our children. That would be irresponsible. It's sort of, I wouldn't mind a bit of debt if it also came alongside council houses and high-speed rail and all this stuff that I could use for the rest of my life. And if I have children, my children can use for the rest of their life. It's just a very short-sighted way of looking at it that we've had since the 1980s. As you say, right up until the privatization of the Royal Mail in the 2010s. Let's go to our next story. We're going back to the Charlie Kirk assassination, but from a very different angle. There is something painfully modern about Charlie Kirk's assassination. He was a man whose prominence came from viral clips on social media, and grimly, the moment of his death would be played to millions on social media. And the reaction of some of those actually present when he was shot has shown how even traumatic events witnessed in close proximity and in real life can still end up being mediated by a smartphone.
It's your boy out on TikTok. There was just a gunshot at Charlie Kirk. We're in Utah. There's a gunfire. This is not a joke. Hey, let's go. It's your boy Outer TikTok. There was just a gunfire in Utah. This is not a drill. There is a gunfire in Utah. Shots fired here in Utah. This is not a joke. Charlie Kirk, Elder TikTok, Mormon Central, Utah. There was a gun that just fired off here at Charlie Kirk. I am not playing with y'all. Hey, make sure you go to church on Sunday. Read the Book of Mormon. This is not a drill. I'm not playing with y'all. Hey, Jesus is Lord. Jesus will protect you. Jesus is your savior, bro. I'm not even lying. Make sure you subscribe to Elder TikTok on Instagram.
Jesus is Lord. Jesus will protect you. Jesus is your savior. But I'm not lying. Make sure you subscribe to Elder TikTok on Instagram. Aaron, have you? So this is like he's sort of explained afterwards. He was sort of very close to the front of the queue to speak to Charlie Kirk. So he was right there when this guy got shot in the neck, and he knows what's happened because he's telling his viewers it. And his first response is to sort of get out his smartphone and say, subscribe to my Instagram. This guy's just been shot. Like, what the? I mean, he has apologized. We're going to go to his apology in a moment. But I mean, this is new, right? So I don't think there's been a time in human civilization where something like that happens. And well, obviously the technology wasn't there, but what does it mean that sort of when tragedies or shocking things happen, people immediately get out their phone and try and get new followers?
Well, there's two readings of it, right? One is very charitable, which is he was in shock. So he was behaving in an irrational way. And there's some truth to that. I saw an interview with somebody who was smiling when she was talking about what happened. She'd literally seen Charlie Kirk be shot in the neck. That's a very traumatic, shocking thing for anybody, by the way, left or right, to see somebody die like that. So maybe there's part of it is a shock response. But I think that probably disinhibited him to such an extent that he just did something which comes very naturally to him, which is this is an opportunity to garner attention, to get followers. Look, followers are currency, right? In the world we live in, it's social currency. Status is this incredibly mediatized thing now out there in the ether. So I think it disinhibited him, but it is new. And we're talking about a fundamental pathology of the attention economy, which is deeply, deeply, deeply unhealthy. Deeply unhealthy. And we're all part of it. I am better than that guy. I would never do that. But we all have at some point participated in that attention economy at some point. Okay. Some people more than others, I'm sure, but it's a pathology which is, I think, increasingly emblematic of our age. You know, this distills the spirit of our age. You know, if you want to talk about, you know, the early 19th century, the spirit of the age, it's going to be, you know, a bourgeois in Mitteleuropa, you know, reading his paper. You know, this, I think Hegel talks about this, right? The spirit of our age is somebody who's at a shooting and somebody's dying and they get out their phone and it's about attention and likes and trying to roll that into a form of digitized prestige. It is clearly very strange. And I think what's unique about America, Michael, is the fusion of that with religion. Now, I'm not saying that just Christians do that, and I'm not suggesting it doesn't happen in other countries. But I think something that's probably quite distinct between the UK and the US is the two largest, as I think, yeah, they are the two largest Anglophone countries, not including India. The two largest Anglophone countries. Of course, India has a range of languages. That feels to me like the biggest difference. This fusion of a quite unhealthy, pathologized attention economy with claims of higher religious values. And look, I think this is anything but in keeping with Christian doctrine. You know, I can't remember where it is in the Gospels, but it's about not praying loudly. Don't pray loudly to bring attention to yourself. You're not a person of God if you do that. I think this chap's taken that to the nth degree, hasn't he?
I suppose I was just, while you were saying that, thinking that actually I was potentially overstating how new this is, because sort of the phenomenon of the sort of tabloid journalist with a camera sort of being really inappropriate and trying to get the scene, to get the most gory picture, and then sort of like when a family is subject to tragedy, sort of doorstepping them and because all they want is more readers for their newspaper. That's actually sort of a well-known trait of especially tabloid journalism, and especially in Britain, actually, for decades. But I suppose the idea that is now not just confined to a very particular group of professionals, but now sort of something which is percolating out into the wider population probably does have significance. I said the guy had sort of apologized. He's, just for reference, because we haven't explained yet, actually, he's called Elder TikTok. He's a Utah influencer who posts about Polynesian culture and Mormonism, who says he loves Charlie Kirk. And after backlash about his video live from the scene of Kirk's shooting, he posted this apology.
In regards to my video that I posted, it was wrong. It was bad. It was very insensitive. It was very inappropriate, and it just straight up wrong. It was a mistake, and I apologize for that. I apologize for my insensitivity. When I posted it, I did it without thinking. What had happened was I was actually in line to ask Charlie Kirk a question. I was so excited, and there was 5 people, and then it was me. So I was right there in the front. I saw everything happen. I was right there. After it happened and everyone started moving and running, my instant reaction was just start filming, document everything just in case. So I started filming. My mistake and my wrongdoing was what I said. And I said it because in the moment I was not thinking straight, and that's on me. I'll take fault for that. Like, I've never been in a shooting before, but I should have maybe just kept composed, relaxed, and not be so sensitive to post or impulsive to film and post. So
the whole video is interesting. I found the whole video interesting, Aaron, because he was sort of saying it. I know you guys trust me, you're my followers, you trust me, and that's a really important relationship, and I've abused your trust. And it just, I mean, we have it on this show to some degree, this sort of parasocial relationship where people watch you and they sort of trust your opinion or trust what you're saying. But it seems odd, doesn't it? This sort of guy who just goes around with his camera. You know, we have a team behind us at least, but it's just a single guy, a lone guy on his camera who just walks around filming stuff, talking to stuff, and feels like he has this responsibility to speak to. I think he has maybe over 100,000 followers. I don't know what to say that's more articulate than just it's weird. But briefly, do you think his apology seemed sincere? And then we're going to wrap up.
You know, I mean, again, it's just not for me to judge. He can ask for people's forgiveness. I mean, whose forgiveness is he asking? You know, like from Charlie Kirk's wife. I mean, anyway, and him saying it's inappropriate. I don't know, man. I find the whole Christianity shtick in America kind of weird, personally. I mean, I think many Brits feel the same way. People who are atheists but also religious. The whole point of the gospel, I think, as far as I've read it, is about treating others as you wish to be treated and asking forgiveness and repenting when you sin. A guy died. And again, it's not about like he's a wonderful man or he's a bad man. I just think it's such a strange instinct. And I think that's one of the really important things. You know, people talk about divisions in society or polarization. 99% of people, when they see the video, which I'm sure many of the people watching and listening have seen, of blood just, you know, gushing from Charlie Kirk's neck, I think most people are, because there's millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to find that stuff like frightening and scary. So in the moment, like I say, you can point to a shock response. He was excited about asking the question. There's a ton of adrenaline because something's happened. I get it, you know. It shouldn't define the rest of your life or whatever. But it's not about being inappropriate. You know, somebody died. So I'm probably not the right person to ask, Michael. I'm for a lot of our audience, I'm a boring 41-year-old man now. But the whole tone I just find incredibly surreal, frankly.
We're all just going to get older and more boring, but hopefully we'll retain our audience's trust. Aaron Bastani, thank you for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. And I said about the JFK books, they were literally behind me. This is James W. Douglas, JFK and the Unspeakable. And you mentioned the Oliver Stone documentary. It's based on this book. On the Trail of the Assassins, One Man's Quest to Solve the Murder of President Kennedy by Jim Garrison. And so when I say these things, when I say that Lee Harvey Oswald, I don't think was acting alone, and when I say that there were deeper political forces behind the JFK assassination, you might disagree, but I have read something about it. Those are 2 very good books. I do really recommend the Jim Garrison book. And frankly, I think once you read it, you won't think anything else than the official story isn't particularly accurate.
I mean, there are a lot of conspiracies in the United States in the 60s and 70s and 50s, many of which were true. Let's wrap up there. Thank you guys for watching. We'll be back on Monday at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.